Hellfire Pass Museum Visit, Kanchanaburi, Thailand, August 2025. Hellfire Pass, known by the Japanese as Konyu Cutting, is the name of a railway cutting on the former Burma Railway, better known as the Death Railway, in Thailand. It was built with forced labor during World War II. More than 250,000 Southeast Asian civilians and more than 130,000 Allied prisoners of war built the railway line, including Hellfire Pass. The pass is noted for the harsh conditions and heavy loss of life suffered by its laborers during construction. It was called Hellfire Pass because of the sight of emaciated prisoners laboring by burning torchlight resembled a scene from hell. This is the entrance to the Hellfire Pass Interpretive Center. Here is a friendly greeting by a staff member. The first plaque. With a whistle of incredulity and dismay, we learned that we were to make a cutting into a rocky mountain. The primitive tools and earth-carrying stretchers were issued immediately, and we commenced work on the cutting that was to become the most infamous section of the railway, Hellfire Pass. Men toiled and sweated and were driven mercilessly. Men were flogged and men collapsed. Men were battered, limbs were broken. Men died. Prisoners of war carry sleepers for the railway line, about 40 kilometers south of Thambuzayat, Burma, about 1943. Kwai Noi Valley. This representative image of the Hellfire Pass area is a unique perspective of this section of the 415-kilometer Burma-Thailand Railway. In this vicinity, a sequence of bridges and embankments are needed to keep the railway route along the escarpment level. There were also many camps housing the thousands of workers, including Australians. Kwai Noi River, Hellfire Pass, hammer and tap cutting, 7-meter embankment, 3-tier bridge, Hintok cutting. A better look at the river in relation to Hellfire Pass. A better look at hammer and tap cutting and 7-meter embankment. A better look at 3-tier bridge and Hintok cutting. The area as it looks from the information center. A bit of wood from the railway sleepers of the railway. 2 walls filled with panels containing the names of POWs who died building the railway. This room lists the names of those who died building the Burma Railroad, the Burma Death Railway. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor and launched assaults on Wake Island, Guam, Shanghai, Malaya, and Midway. On the 8th, Japanese troops entered Thailand. On the 10th, they landed in the Philippines. And on the 11th, they entered Burma. The next information panel, Dedication and Hellfire Pass, the Second World War. Dedication. The Hellfire Pass Interpretive Center, Walkaway, and Memorial are dedicated to all who suffered and died on the Burma-Thailand Railway. They honor all prisoners of war of the Japanese, including thousands of Australian, Dutch, British, and American servicemen and Asian civilian laborers who were forced to work to build a railway connecting Burma and Thailand during the Second World War. The prisoners were subjected to starvation, disease, and unthinkable brutality, and many lost their lives. This place is dedicated to their memory. On behalf of the Australian government, the Office of Australian War Graves acknowledges the ongoing commitment and support of the Government of the Kingdom of Thailand and the Thai Armed Forces Development Command. Hellfire Pass. The ground below this center was a place of immense suffering during the Second World War. Allied prisoners of war of the Japanese, including thousands of Australian, Dutch, American, British, and Asian laborers, were forced to build a railway connecting Burma and Thailand. What became a railbed was once a mass of solid rock. Men had to dig a cutting through it with little more than hand tools. At night, it looked like a scene from Dante's Inferno, recalled one prisoner. If you stood on top of the cutting, you would see the burning fires at intervals of about 20 feet. You'd see the shadows of the Japanese moving around with sticks, belting men. You could distinguish the prisoners moving rocks around, hammering and clearing. There was shouting and bellowing, and this went on all night. For this reason, the Allies named this area Hellfire Pass. Just a few hundred meters long, the pass is emblematic of the brutality and starvation suffered by all who worked on the 415-kilometer Burma-Thailand Railway. The next panel, the War in Europe. The War in Europe. The Second World War began in September 1939 after Germany invaded Poland. By late 1941, German troops occupied territory from the English Channel to the Western Soviet Union and from Scandinavia to North Africa. German defeats at El Alamein in October 1942 and at Stalingrad in February 1943, the growing industrial capacity of her enemies and her inability to prevent millions of tons of shipping from reaching England from the Americas turned the tide of war against Germany. By the time the Western Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, German troops had been driven from North Africa, Rome had fallen, Soviet forces were approaching the German frontier, and German cities were suffering under increasingly heavy aerial bombardment. Germany collapsed and surrendered in May 1945 under the weight of a two-front war, with Soviet troops having taken Berlin and with most of the country under Allied occupation. Japan enters the war. By 1940, Japan had been at war in Manchuria and China for almost a decade and needed the natural resources of Southeast Asia to continue her campaigns. Japanese troops moved into French Indochina at the invitation of the German-aligned Vichy French government in September 1940. The United States, Britain, Australia, and Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, imposed sanctions, which were tightened when Japan occupied the rest of Indochina months later. Without access to oil, Japan needed to withdraw or to occupy the resource-rich colonial territories in Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. With the Soviets at war with Germany and unable to intervene, Japan launched an aerial attack against the United States at Pearl Harbor and carried out amphibious landings on the Malay Peninsula in December 1941. Doubting her ability to win militarily, Japan hoped for a settlement, allowing her to keep her conquests, particularly if Germany prevailed in Europe. Japan's rapid advance. After the attacks on Pearl Harbor and Malaya on 7th and 8th December 1941, Japan made a series of rapid conquests in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. In February 1942, they took Singapore, capturing tens of thousands of troops in one of the Allies' most devastating military defeats. Japanese forces had gained the oil fields on Borneo and were fighting the Dutch and local troops on Java and Sumatra. Their victories continued as more Allied troops surrendered, and at the end of March 1942, the Dutch East Indies came under Japanese control. From Timor to New Britain, Japanese troops occupied most of the islands to Australia's north and were threatening Port Moresby. Australians feared an invasion, but the Japanese weren't able to marshal sufficient forces for such a vast undertaking. Allied prisoners of war, POWs. During the war's early months, approximately 250,000 Allied troops and nurses were captured by the Japanese. Hundreds were massacred, but most were taken into captivity. Japan took British and Dominion prisoners mainly on Singapore and in the Dutch East Indies, where thousands of Dutch and colonial troops were also captured. Australians were also taken prisoner on Ambon, New Britain, and Timor, and in the Philippines, thousands of Americans surrendered. Prisoners in Japanese captivity were used as forced laborers across the conquered territories and in Japan, and suffered terrible privation and brutality. They were overworked, beaten, starved, denied medicine, and in some cases executed. Many were transported on overcrowded hell ships, some of which were sunk by Allied submarines, causing enormous loss of life. Early in the war, the largest prison camps were in Singapore, Java, and the Philippines. On Ambon and New Britain, Australian prisoners were massacred, as they had been in Malaya. Most of the surviving prisoners on New Britain lost their lives when the ship transporting them to Hainan was torpedoed. In 1945, as Allied forces fought their way across towards Japan and liberated occupied territory in Southeast Asia, some Japanese captors decided to kill their prisoners. In Borneo, some 2,600 Australian and British prisoners of war died in the Sandakan death marches. The war's sudden, unexpected, and undoubtedly saved the lives of thousands of prisoners. Romusha. As well as having a large POW labor force, the Japanese relied on Asian laborers known as Romusha. An estimated 200,000 Romusha worked for the Japanese, many on the Burma-Thailand Railway. Promised wages, good conditions, and the chance to bring their families to work camps. Volunteers soon began reporting ill treatment, leading the Japanese to conscript laborers rather than seek to persuade them. Lacking the organization of military prisoners, the Romusha suffered under even worse conditions. Tens of thousands died of diseases like cholera and dysentery. Some were beaten to death, and others succumbed to exhaustion and malnutrition. Few records were kept. Most Burmusha were illiterate, and those who weren't left no surviving accounts. But some 90,000 are believed to have lost their lives working for the Japanese in Southeast Asia. The destruction of the Perth, February 28, 1942, by Ray Parkin, 1943 to 1946. A video encompassing World War II in Asia. Slim River, a stop on the railway journey from Singapore to Bampong, by Jack Chalker, 1945. The Burma-Thailand Railway Information Panel. Origins. In 1942, Japanese forces in Burma were isolated from neighboring countries by mountains and thick jungle, making the country's principal port of Rangoon the main point of entry for reinforcements, supplies, and equipment. As the threat from Allied submarines and aircraft made the sea route to Burma increasingly dangerous, the Japanese sought an alternative. British surveyors had studied the possibility of a railway from Thambu Zayat in Burma to Bampong in Thailand early in the 20th century, but the terrain, the number of river crossings, and the prevalence of disease convinced them that it was too difficult. The Japanese had studied a similar route some years before the war. In 1942, the availability of a large labor force, Allied prisoners of war, and Asian civilian laborers, known as Romusha, made quick construction possible, and in June that year, the Japanese decided to proceed. Plans. The railway route surveyed by the Japanese traversed more than 400 kilometers of jungle, mountains, and rivers. The labor force of POWs and Romusha would work from opposite ends of the line and from points in between, overseen by soldiers of Japanese railway regiments, some 12,000 men. Most materials were to be sourced locally, with bridging material, steel rails, and rolling stock coming from Japan. Construction began in 1942, and the Japanese estimated that the line would be completed by December 1943. The plan was ambitious, but the Japanese had available what was in effect an unlimited supply of slave labor, and no obstacle of weather, terrain, or climate would be allowed to hinder progress for long. Progress. Sections of the line were built all along the line simultaneously, joining as they met. Work on the Burmese and Thai ends of the railway initially progressed quickly on flat, lightly vegetated land, but as the line ran deeper into hilly jungle, crossing many rivers, and the monsoons turned the ground to mud, the work became harder and much slower. Construction dropped behind schedule. Fears of a British counterattack in Burma made completion of the line more urgent, as the need for a supply line increased. The Japanese now wanted the railway to be finished in August 1943, but this proved impossible, and it was finally completed on 16th October. Working on a Thailand Railway Cutting by Murray Griffin, 1945. The Speedo Period. Working conditions. As the Japanese became more desperate to finish the railway, they worked the prisoners and the Romusha to the limits of endurance, often to death. The Speedo, as it was known, was a time of enormous privation and suffering for those who worked on the railway. One ex-prisoner remembered working for 150 consecutive days. Another recalled working shifts of between 18 and 20 hours, and at one stage, prisoners 33 hours without rest. The prisoners worked for 33 hours without rest. In some camps during Speedo, up to half the prisoners died. In others, the figure was lower, but the pressure to complete the line meant extremely ill men were sent out to work, though many were too weak to stand. Treatment. The way the Japanese treated prisoners and Romusha throughout the railway's construction was generally harsh, ranging from neglect to physical violence. Beatings were common and sometimes fatal. Malnourished prisoners had to march sometimes hundreds of kilometers from one camp to another. The Japanese attitude to prisoners, that surrender was dishonorable, and that prisoners of war had no rights or status and were slaves of the emperor, meant, said an Australian brigadier, that the Japanese did not consider human life of any value when the railway must be pushed on regardless of the cost. Discipline was enforced by brutality. Beatings and other forms of punishment for minor offenses were common. The main display room. The huge rectangular cage of stones was symbolic of the amount of stones that each prisoner was expected to move each day. The small bowl demonstrates the amount of food, mainly poor quality rice, that the prisoners were fed every day, and only once per day. This made the labor nearly impossible over time due to lack of calories and nutrition for such labor. An Incident on the Burma Railway by Murray Griffin, 1946. Resistance. Sabotage. The prisoners knew that the railway was of great military importance to the Japanese. They and the Romusha were forced to work, but the prisoners did not want to contribute to Japan's war effort. Various means were used to sabotage the line, from placing termite nests next to the bridge supports to substituting softwood for hardwood in the construction, or by failing to properly sink supporting piles. However, prisoners racked by hunger and disease would have had little energy for damaging a line that they would have to repair again, and the presence of guards who did not hesitate to beat workers, sometimes to death, and who could exercise brutal punishment for any misdemeanor or none, made sabotage difficult. Defiance. Perhaps the most common image of defiance on the Burma-Thailand Railway is that of an officer, often a doctor, standing between a prisoner and a guard, saving a man from a beating at considerable personal risk. But prisoners defied their captors in other ways, too. Some risked taking photographs of their fellow POWs and their camps. Others made drawings depicting the terrible suffering or kept diaries of their time in captivity. Any prisoner caught attempting to document their experience were liable to be executed. Several Australians kept radios hidden in water bottles, jam tins, and even an artificial leg, helping to maintain morale, but risked death if caught. A handful of prisoners chose to defy the Japanese by escaping captivity. None succeeded in gaining freedom, and almost all were executed upon recapture. The March Up Country from Bampong to Konyu by Jack Chalker, 1942. Manual labor. With their urgent need to have the line completed, the Japanese worked their prisoners and other laborers to exhaustion, expecting most of the work to be done by hand. The labor was often preceded by long marches to distant camps, in some places of daily walks of several kilometers to get to the work site. Once there, workers on the railway drilled into rock using hammers and drills, hauled logs and sleepers, constructed bridges and viaducts using mostly wood cut from the jungle, moved tons of earth, and cleared vegetation. The labor, carried out by starved and ill workers using damaged and blunt tools, was done under the eye of sometimes brutal guards and carried many risks for the wretched workforce. Bridges and cuttings. There were 14 kilometers of bridge work along the railway's 415-kilometer course. Most were wooden trestle bridges made from trees felled in the jungle. But eight major crossings were steel and concrete constructions. Bridge work required large work parties and exposed laborers to the risks of performing heavy labor high off the ground, being struck by falling timbers, or being drowned in the river. More than 30 prisoners died when the Pack of Cards Bridge collapsed several times during construction. Some 3 million cubic meters of rock were shifted in building the railway, much of it taken from cuttings dug to maintain a steady gradient along the line. Cuttings were cut through solid rock by filling manually drilled holes up to a meter deep with explosives. After the blast, prisoners and Romusha cleared the debris by hand. Konyu cutting is the most well known, but there were many others along the railway. Ulcer Operation, Thailand Railway by Murray Griffin, 1945 to 1946. Illness and injury. Prisoners and Romusha were at constant risk of disease. Conditions that in civilian life would be considered a serious illness were commonplace and rarely kept the afflicted from being sent to work. Few escaped the diseases of malnutrition and starvation, like beriberi and pellagra, and many succumbed. Small cuts could become tropical ulcers that ate away at flesh and bone, leading sometimes to the amputation of the affected limb, a procedure that could be fatal. Dengue fever and malaria were also common. One doctor working on the line said that the men were reduced to the status of a malarious, dysenteric, underfed, and overworked slave gang. For Romusha, who had neither leadership nor infrastructure and medical aid, the situation was even worse, and they died of illness in their tens of thousands. Medical care. 44 Australian prisoner of war doctors spent time on the railway. They treated serious illnesses and watched patients die for want of food and medicine. We improvised and carefully husbanded every little bit of stuff we got, said one about the desperate shortages in the camps. When the Japanese demanded workers, doctors had to choose which sick men were fit enough, knowing that really none were. They treated the victims of Japanese brutality, and in standing up for their patients were often also beaten. Doctors received invaluable assistance from medical orderlies who performed vital nursing tasks, changing bedpans and dressings, assisting in medical procedures and operations, cremating the dead, and giving care and compassion to the ill. Most orderlies had little or no medical training. They were spared work on the line, but risked their own lives and health to care for their fellow prisoners. Improvisation. Doctors, practitioners of POW medicine, improvised for almost everything. They lacked medical supplies, operating theaters, diagnostic and sterilizing equipment, syringes, and bandages. They experimented with what they had learned about tropical diseases and about which plants had medicinal properties, from Dutch doctors who had worked or grown up in the East Indies. Camp doctors devised ways to dilute and make anesthetic drugs go further. They took advantage of bamboo's versatility, sharpening it to make cannulas and using it for splints and crutches, bowls, containers, and bedpans. Different doctors employed different methods. To treat tropical ulcers, some used camp-made ointments. Others combined rubber sap with formalin to create a rubber bandage or wrapped the affected limb in banana leaves. Some used maggots or had men stand in the river while fish ate their dead flesh. Whatever methods they used, doctors did all they could to save the lives on the railway. Cholera Tent, Hintok, by Jack Chalker, 1945. POWs. More than 60,000 prisoners worked on the railway. In 1946, the Allied War Graves Registration Unit concluded that about 12,500 lost their lives, including some 6,300 British, 2,800 Australian, and 2,500 Dutch. The dead were buried or cremated in the camps where they died. "Dying was easy," said one prisoner. "It was living that was hard." For the living, survival meant more work, deeper exhaustion, and the same meager rations and illness. Men needed a reason to keep going, a family, a vision of the future, or a refusal to yield to a hated enemy. Romusha. Early in 1943, the Japanese began recruiting Tamil, Chinese, Malay, Javanese, Burmese, and Thai laborers. They were contracted, usually for 6 months, but, said one Australian, very few got back. Romusha were kept at work in the most appalling conditions, paid a pittance with no hope of buying anything. They were starving and as neglected as the prisoners. They lived in squalor, without the organization and services of the POW, and diseases, particularly cholera, ran rampant through their camps. They were the real victims of the railway, said an Australian doctor. About 1/3 of them died. For Romusha, survival was even more a matter of chance than it was for the prisoners of war. Japanese. Thousands of Japanese soldiers served on the railway. They lived far more comfortably than their prisoners, but everyone on the line suffered in the climate and was at risk of disease. Some Japanese viewed their service on the railway with great pride. They completed a task once deemed impossible by Europeans in less than a year. Many Japanese believed their prisoners, disgraced by surrender, were fulfilling the emperor's will, and the Japanese were themselves under enormous pressure to get the work finished. In Japan, a locomotive from the railway stands as a memorial to its completion. It is the focus of an annual ceremony honoring members of the railway regiments who died during the war. About 1,000 Japanese soldiers died on the railway. They are remembered in Kanchanaburi with a memorial erected by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1945. Actually, February 1944. The battle for Imphal was from March to May 1944, and Kohima, where the Imperial Japanese Army was decisively defeated, was from 4th April to 22nd June 1944. So the Japanese in the region still thought that they were winning when the monument and cenotaphs were created. It can still be seen today near the town's railway bridge. After the railway. POW hell ships. When the railway was finished, some prisoners of war remained in Thailand and Burma. Many were returned to Changi in Singapore, and others were sent to Indochina. Over the following months, many were transported to Japan or parts of the Japanese Empire to work as laborers. Travel by sea was one of the most dangerous periods in any prisoner's time in captivity. 1,000 men might be crammed, sometimes locked, into a hold meant for just a few hundred, with little food and water. Prisoners had to endure voyages that could last from 10 to 70 days. They dubbed the transports hell ships. About 156 such voyages were made by 134 individual ships that together carried about 126,000 prisoners. Around 20 hell ships were sunk or seriously damaged. Approximately 22,000 prisoners, including more than 2,000 Australians, lost their lives in these incidents, 19 of which were caused by Allied action. Japan labor camps. By early 1945, almost 3,000 Australians were in camps in Japan, mostly next to work sites running south from Tokyo to Nagasaki. Some reached Japan in 1942, but by late 1944 and 1945, as increasing numbers of Japanese were called up to defend the country, more prisoners were needed as laborers in the industries that supplied Japan's armed forces. They worked in mines, shipyards, and factories, and while conditions did not compare with the railway, they were still subjected to brutality and ill treatment, were often poorly fed, and were denied effective medical care. During the war's final months, prisoners in Japan were witness to, and sometimes victims of, American air raids, raising hopes that their ordeal was coming to an end and fears that they would be killed as the Allies drew closer. Liberation. The end of the Second World War found Allied prisoners dispersed across the Japanese Empire. News of the war's end reached many as rumor through secret wireless sets or local civilians. In Japan, word reached the prisoners almost as quickly as it reached Japanese people, who had been told to wait for a special announcement on 15th August 1945. For the first time ever, the Emperor addressed his subjects, announcing Japan's surrender. Said one prisoner, "All looked stunned and forlorn." For prisoners who had waited years for this news, it was hard to believe. Individuals reacted in their own way. Some were subdued and reflective, while others joyous. In Thailand, an Australian prisoner saw very little display of emotion, just a more cheerful atmosphere. After the war ended, recovery teams located almost 14,000 Australian prisoners, about two-thirds of the some 22,000 who went into captivity. POW just returned from Burma by Murray Griffin, about 1943. This means that either the year is wrong or the POW was returned to Changi POW camp in Singapore. Repatriated Prisoner of War is Processed by Stella Brown, 1945. Homecoming. In September and October 1945, almost 14,000 Australian prisoners of the Japanese came home. Some came from Japan through Okinawa and Manila and sailed home on aircraft carriers. Most in Southeast Asia were flown to Changi, where they waited for space on a ship. The sick took priority and were brought home on specially fitted aircraft or ships. The process did not always run smoothly. Some waited in camps for weeks, anxious to know what lay in store. Many were ambivalent about coming home, about how they would be received by the Australian community, and about how they would cope among people who could never comprehend the magnitude of their ordeal. The first group home arrived at Sydney's Rose Bay aboard Catalina aircraft. A journalist wrote, "One man stood and looked on his native land, tears pouring down his cheeks." It is a scene that must have been repeated around Australia many times in 1945. Reunion. While thousands of Australians were held in captivity, their families endured a very different ordeal. Many waited for years, not knowing whether their loved one was alive or dead. Some prisoners, survivors of hell ship sinkings, returned home in 1944, but were told to refrain from making their ordeal public, to spare the families of those still in captivity. Most families only learned of the prisoners' suffering from newspaper reports soon after the Japanese surrender. They resolved to ease returning prisoners into family and civilian life, only to find the years of enforced separation had created too great a distance to easily bridge. Routines and roles developed in wartime now had to accommodate a man who, though familiar, was also a stranger. Legacy. Many families felt the war's effects for years afterwards. Wives kept awake by their husbands' nightmares, problems with drink, violence, emotional distance, children fearful of a traumatized father. This was not the case for all, but for a significant number of prisoners' families. The war did not end with their return. Outside the home, some former POWs found themselves unable to resume their pre-war occupation. Disease robbed men of their sight. Some had lost a limb, or had simply been so ravaged by abuse, neglect, and ill health that they lacked the fitness to do jobs that were once routine. Some never worked again. For others' families, the death of a loved one in captivity meant a lifetime of sorrow, while survivors feared for their health, worried that their lives had been shortened by the years of brutality and starvation. I never heard one of the men complain about the hand that fate had dealt them. Some died with mud-stained photos of their loved ones clutched in their bony hand. One of the last to die was sleeping restlessly a few paces up from me. In his delirium, he was making a noise similar to a groan. I was too sick to move. For 2 days I listened to that groan. Then it suddenly came to me. It wasn't a groan at all. He was trying to hum Silent Night. When a man died, he died in an aura of love and brotherhood. You died with your head in the lap of a mate, with someone holding your hand, with somebody with a hand on your forehead, saying a little prayer. Stan Arniel, Prisoner of War. Thambu War Cemetery, 1955. The wooden crosses seen here were ultimately replaced by bronze plaques on a stone base. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the Office of Australian War Graves. The fundamental duties and responsibilities of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, CWGC, have remained consistent for more than a century, since it was established by Royal Charter in May 1917, to record the names and maintain, in perpetuity, the graves and memorials of the Commonwealth forces who died in the First and later Second World War. Following Japan's surrender, the CWGC deployed a survey party to locate prisoner of war cemeteries and grave sites along the Burma-Thailand Railway. They also found and recovered documents, diaries, drawings, and photographic negatives secretly buried under instructions of senior POW officers in the graves of deceased POWs. As a result of the survey, 10,549 graves were located in 144 cemeteries. After the graves were located and marked, came the sensitive and arduous process of reburying the dead. Allied authorities selected cemetery locations in Thambusayat in Burma and Kanchanaburi and Chung Kai in Thailand. Kanchanaburi War Cemetery is the largest, with 5,084 Commonwealth and 1,896 Dutch soldiers interred. The names of those cremated and whose ashes lie in 2 grave sites marked with a headstone inscribed, "A soldier of the 1939-45 war, known unto God," are memorialized with a name within the cemetery's stone pavilion. Chung Kai War Cemetery, on the site of a wartime hospital, is the final resting place of 1,427 Commonwealth and 314 Dutch prisoners. Office of Australian War Graves. The Office of Australian War Graves, OAWG, manages this centre. It is responsible for the Australian government's program of official commemoration. There are some 66,000 Australian war dead in identified graves around the world, while some 35,000 are commemorated on memorials to the missing. As the agent of the CWGC in Australia, OAWG maintains war graves and individual war cemeteries in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, and commemorates eligible veterans who died post-war and whose deaths were caused by their war service. The OAWG is also responsible for building and maintaining memorials like this one in many overseas locations. Center staff can provide you with more information about the Office of Australian War Graves. Hellfire Pass. This is Hellfire Pass, also known as Konyu Cutting. The name Hellfire Pass came from the appalling working conditions at and around this site. In mid-1943, when the Japanese introduced the Speedo period to meet tight deadlines for completing the railway, prisoners were forced to work long hours into the night. Their work site was lit by oil lamps and bamboo fires. This flickering light, the noise from the drilling of the rock, and the shuffling of hundreds of poorly fed prisoners seemed the very image of hell. Cuttings. Cuttings like this one formed a critical function on the Thai-Burma Railway, as they allowed the rail track to climb at a steady gradient. The task of carving cuttings deep and wide enough to allow the railway to pass through mountainous terrain was colossal, particularly as much of the excavation was done without modern equipment. The image of the railway cutting known as Hellfire Pass, Thailand, circa September 1945. A common method of drilling the rock was hammer and tap. One man would hold the drill, the tap, while another drove it into the rock by wielding a hammer of 3.6 to 4.5 kilograms, or 8 to 10 pounds. After each blow, the man wielding the hammer, another man would rotate the drill to prevent it from becoming stuck in the rock. 3 progressively longer lengths of tap were used as the prisoners drilled deeper into the rock. Dynamite would be placed into the holes after a series of holes were completed. Hugh Clark, an Australian prisoner of war, recalled, "The engineers would plug it with dynamite, get 6 or 7 of us out, and give us a cigarette. We would light a cigarette each. We would have to light 4 or 5 fuses, and then go run for our lives up into the bush before the charges blew." From Of Elephants and Men, in Gavin McCormick and Hank Nelson, edited. The Burma-Thailand Railway, Memory and History, Sydney, Alan Unwin. Hammer and Tap Manual Drilling into Rock by Jack Chalker. A tour group in the Hellfire Pass. A particular memorial spot in the pass with many small Australian flags, a string of England flags, and a large Australian flag. A wider view of the location showing remaining tracks from the railway. Reading the plaque at the location.
These rails and sleepers are from the official railway and were relayed in Konyu cutting in April 1989 by the men of C Company, 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. They were relocated to the current position in 2006. Here, Konyu Crossing, Hellfire Pass.
More information.
Hellfire Pass Memorial. Hellfire Pass, Konyu Cutting, is an example of the type of excavations of the 415-kilometer Burma-Thailand Railway, constructed in 1942 to 1943 by American, Australian, British, and Dutch prisoners of war and conscripted nationals from Burma, Malaya, and Thailand. From Nong Pladuk, the railway traversed the flat plain to Kanchanaburi, where it crossed the Mae Klong River. Then followed the course of the Kwai Noi River through Nam Tok, present terminus of the operative section, and Sayok National Park, passing through Three Pagoda Pass and over the foothills and coastal plains of Burma, to its junction with the existing Mo Mai and Yi railway line at Tam Uzayat. The railway was functional from October 1943 to June 1945, with occasional interruptions caused by bomb damage. Hellfire Pass and the adjacent cuttings were excavated by POW laborers working in round-the-clock shifts over a desperate period of 12 weeks in 1943. The name Hellfire Pass relates to the awesome scene presented at night by the light from torches and lamps in the cutting. This work was done without the aid of reliable mechanical equipment. The most primitive of hand tools were used to drill holes for the explosives used in blasting the rock and for removing the waste rock. This section of the railway required the construction of many large embankments, trestle bridges, and deep cuttings, as the route left the relatively flat high ground and reversed northward along the steep valley wall. One of the most famous trestle bridges was built in this area, Hitok or Patokard's Bridge, so named because it collapsed 3 times during construction. It was constructed in 3 weeks out of unseasoned timber fastened with wooden pegs, spikes, bamboo ties, and rattan rope. The Konyu cutting and other rock excavations and embankment in this area will serve as a memorial to the thousands of lives so tragically sacrificed in the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, and to the Thai people who risked their lives to supply medicines and food to the prisoners during these dangerous times. Presented by the Australian Thai Chamber of Commerce for the Australian Government, April 26, 1987. Again, here is some of the equipment used to build this railway cutting.
and more information.
The American Prisoner of War Memorial. This memorial honors the approximately 690 American prisoners of war who labored for the Japanese captors under horrific conditions on the Burma Thai Railway and the Thais who risked their lives to support them. Most of the American prisoners of war were captured on Java in the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia. They were primarily soldiers along with sailors and Marines from the USS Houston, a United States Navy heavy cruiser, sunk in the Sunda Strait in the early hours of March 1st, 1942. Before sinking, the USS Houston's crew rescued merchant marines and soldiers of the 2nd and 131st Field Artillery, 36th Division, Texas National Guard, from a torpedoed troop transport ship which had been sent to assist with the defense of the Dutch East Indies. As the fate remained unknown until the end of the war, the 2nd of the 131st became known as the Lost Battalion. Aside from the United States service members, several American civilians captured by Japanese on Java were sent to work on the railway. Approximately 134 Americans died on the Burma Thai Railway, and all were repatriated to American soil following the war. This section of the railway, known as Hellfire Pass, is a stark reminder of the grueling conditions experienced by Allied prisoners of war and thousands of Asian civilians forced to labor for the Japanese. Given on this day by the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the United States of America, 26th October 2023.
And the last information.
This monument is for the Burma Thailand Railway, 1942 to 1945, in remembrance of all those who suffered and all who died.
And finally,
In their memory, more than 12,500 of some 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and up to 90,000 Romusha died constructing the railway. Their deaths were, for the most part, the result of malnutrition, disease, and overwork. These, in turn, are attributable to the brutality, neglect, and indifference of their captors. Graves. These are graves at the Hintok River by Ray Parkin, 1943 to 56. 5 crosses that the artist recalls as being those marking the graves of British prisoners of war. What caught my eye was the bamboo fronds that made Gothic arches above the graves. This print is one of a folio of dry points from drawings made while the artist was a prisoner of war on the Burma-Thailand Railway. Commemoration. Each year, on 25th April, Anzac Day, a service is held here at the Memorial Obelisk. People gather to greet the dawn, to honor the stories of those who lived, whose lives were forever altered or lost to the railway. At this memorial, as at many memorials in small towns and cities around Australia, people remember those who worked and died during the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway. At this memorial, we pledge to each of them that they will not be forgotten. It was at Konyu. At dawn, you go along there on Anzac Day, and they've got it candlelit, where you go along this very deep cutting. You got to the end, and as the dawn comes, a piper plays the lament, and they sound the last post, and reveille experience, you just can't imagine. They are there. There is no question about that. The spirits of these men are there. The place is just something that grips you on Anzac Day, and everybody there, everybody who is there, feels it. This is by William Bill Haskell of the 2nd of the 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, Australians at War Field Archive.
A sculpture of 2 prisoners of war doing heavy labor. This statue is in the Hellfire Pass Museum. The statue of prisoners of war working on the railway with a Japanese guard watching over them, and one of them being carried away after he collapsed. This sculpture is inside the Jeeth Railway Museum near the bridge on the River Kwai. This museum is now closed. Also in the closed Jeeth Museum, this was a munitions train.